robots. And they say everything started from a big bang 20 billion years ago, but in physics there's a law called the conservation of angular momentum, which says that if you had the big bang that exploded everything, everything should be traveling in the same direction. But we've got the sun spinning clockwise and all 9 planets spinning counterclockwise, and we have 60 moons and 11 of them are spinning backwards. When we look at the Earth is 7,900 miles from the North to South Pole. It's the exact right size to accept the exact right amount of energy from the sun, and it is exact distance from the sun to give us the perfect temperature. And we could go into hundreds of examples and how precisely balanced the Earth is. And if you change these parameters by several percent, in some cases even 0.1%, we'd either freeze to death or roast to death. And so basically the next question becomes, is the solar system and the Earth very young? And really, the evolution-creation debate can be settled pretty quickly if you can prove the Earth is young. As the sun burns, it's losing 5 million tons per second, which means it's shrinking, which means it used to be heavier, which means that gravity was also stronger. So even 20 or 30 million years ago, the sun would be so big it would touch the Earth. Comets should only last 10 to 15,000 years before they're blown apart by the solar wind. Our calendars only go back to the year 4000 BC. How come they don't go back further than that? The population growth curve looked like it started about 4,500 years ago. Well, there was a flood about 4,400 years ago, and 8 people got off the ark. Another question is, how many billions of people should we have by this time? So where are all the people? At least, where are all the bones? The rings orbiting Saturn are being bombarded by comets, and they should be pulverized and dispersed in only about 10,000 years. Scientists admit that the oldest known living tree are the bristlecone pines of California and Nevada, which are 4,300 years old. How come we don't have an older tree? We have the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and after watching it for 20 years, they took a growth rate average, and they found out that the reef is 4,200 years old. But how come we don't have a reef that's older than that? When they drill down into the ground, they often hit oil, and this is often under tremendous pressure, sometimes as high as 20,000 pounds per square inch. And the scientists say that the pressure should have leaked off in about 10 to 15,000 years. But why is it still under pressure if the Earth is so old? Outer space is full of dust. And when they went to the moon and they landed on the moon, the astronauts expected something like 182 feet thick of dust on the moon. And they found, that's why they had these big landing pads, and they found not even 1 full inch of dust on the moon. And the moon is also getting further and further away from the Earth, which means it used to be closer. And there's a law called the inverse square law, which says that if you half the distance, you quadruple the attraction. So even a couple million years ago, the moon would be so close to the Earth that it would cause tides that would flood the Earth twice a day. The Earth's magnetic field cannot be any older than 10,000 years. Otherwise, it would be too strong for life to be comfortable on Earth. The second law of thermodynamics, it's called the law of entropy, which says that anything left to itself gets worse. Things left to itself don't get better, they get worse. Dinosaurs, they say dinosaurs were around, I don't know how many millions of years they're saying, but they found DNA and blood cells in dinosaurs, and blood cells can only last for thousands of years, not millions of years. In Job chapter 40, verse 15, God says, "Behold Behemoth, who has a tail like a cedar." And so I think that that might mean that that was a dinosaur. And basically, in New Zealand, there's a place called the Chatham Rise, and the Japanese come down there to fish a lot, and they pulled up this 4,000-pound, 32-foot skeleton of a dinosaur. And basically, lizards never stop growing. And so if you put them in a pre-flood environment with a water canopy, a lot more oxygen, 800 or 900 years to live, a perfect food supply, no enemies, you've got yourself a dinosaur. In fact, before 1841, dinosaurs were called dragons, and the word dinosaur means a terrible lizard. And so then people ask, is there any evidence for the worldwide flood or what caused it? And basically, Genesis 7, 11, and 12 says, quote, "In the 600th year in the life of Noah, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the floodgates of heaven were opened." So basically what I think might have happened is you had a large planet or comet come close to the Earth, put pressure on the crust of the Earth, and you had a lot of subterranean water that this crack formed around the Earth. This is called the hydroplate theory. And there's a crack, it's called the mid-oceanic ridge, that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. And what happened is the water exploded violently from out of that crack, and caused most of the fossil record. And that's called the hydroplate theory. They talk about the geologic column, how that proves evolution. In the textbooks, they have the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, all these different layers they say are millions of years old. Well, if you get a jar of dirt, shake it up, it'll settle out into layers for you. It's called hydrologic sorting. And so we've found, and people have seen, trees in the sediments going through all these different sediments that they say are millions of years old. And so there's only two explanations for this. One, either the trees grew in the sediments, or two, the sediment came down on top of the trees, and many of these trees are upside down. So all these layers, I believe, were caused from the worldwide flood. In fact, the Grand Canyon, they say that the Grand Canyon had gradually been eroded by the Colorado River. But if that's true, there should be 1,000 cubic miles of sediment at the river mouth, and you go to the river mouth and it's not there. And after the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980, 600 feet of strata were deposited, and in one day it formed a canyon system 1/40th the scale of Grand Canyon. So these things were formed very rapidly and not over a long period of time.
That gradualism is blown apart by just what happened at Mount St. Helens.
Exactly. Evolutionists date the layers of rock by the fossils they contain, and then they date the fossils by the layers of rock that they're in. And this is circular reasoning. And fossils don't simply form when plants or animals simply dot and rot away. To become fossilized, a plant or animal must usually have hard parts such as bone, shell, or wood. It must be quickly buried to prevent decay and must be undisturbed throughout the long process. And the fossil evidence for a worldwide flood catastrophe is everywhere. It's very evident. And fish have been found by the billions with fins extended and eyes bulging. They found mammoths with the last meal perfectly preserved in their stomachs, and that kind of food isn't even found in that area today. They've found whales that are buried straight up and down. They found fish fossilized, giving birth to their babies. They found clams that are petrified, and they're found closed, and when a clam dies, it opens up. The Bible says that all the mountaintops during the flood were submerged underwater. And Edmund Hillary, in 1953, he climbed Mount Everest, and when he reached a 26,000 foot level, for the next 3,000 feet, he found seashells and clams all over the place. So how do you get seashells on every major mountain range only if the worldwide flood really happened? Some people believe Noah's Ark is on the top of Mount Ararat in Turkey. What's interesting is on Mount Ararat itself, they found pillow lava, which is a unique formation that occurs only when molten lava emerges from the earth below water. And they've also found salt crystals on Mount Ararat, which could only be formed underwater. Is there any written evidence for a worldwide flood? Well, the flood account is found on Babylonian, Akkadian, and Sumerian cuneiform tablets, and these all date back to about 700 BC. In fact, a study of universal flood traditions reveals that there are over 200 accounts in every civilization and culture around the world, including the Inca and Aztec cultures. They've gone back to many of these ancient civilizations and found that they're very advanced, having things like natural ventilation, air conditioning. You could go back to Egypt and find that they knew how to make batteries and generate electricity.
People used that for electroplating, didn't they?
Yes, electroplated artifacts they found. The size of the ark, they took a model of the ark and they tested in marine laboratories, and they duplicated 200-foot tidal waves, and they found that the ark was not only seaworthy but extraordinarily stable. And during World War II, the USS New Mexico and Oregon were built on the same proportions as Noah's Ark, 6 times longer than it is wide. And someone says that how could you get all the animals on the ark? And well, first of all, you take the very smallest animals. Dr. Kenneth E. Bell, professor of biology, says, quote, each family of creatures on Earth have a single pair of ancestors. He says there are over 300 varieties of dogs in the world today, but they all have a single common ancestor. And he says that there would have been ample room to load ancestors of all the species we know of today, with room left over for Noah's family, food, and supply. And due to the darkness, due to the storm above, the animals would probably eat less, sleep more, and be in a state of hibernation. Many hundreds of people have claimed to see the Noah's Ark on top of Mount Ararat. One man was Fernand Navarra, a French demolition expert, and he brought back wood that he claimed is from Mount Ararat. And the interesting thing is Mount Ararat is a totally treeless volcano peak, and they found that the wood he brought back doesn't grow near Mount Ararat. In fact, there's not a forest within 300 miles of the mountain. Jim Irwin was a former astronaut, and he took a very interesting picture when he was traveling with a Dutch TV crew, And they took this amazing photograph